Often with a linear story focus, JRPGs can enrapture you in their worlds through the characters, premise or themes covered. But in tandem they also have to make sure that the game is engaging to play. Many JRPGs are able to strike this balance, but fans feel that some have the scale tipped too heavily in one direction. In this video we're going over 7 JRPGs that excel in their story but fall flat in gameplay. And when I talk about gameplay, I'm defining it as an all-encompassing approach. So the combat, the exploration, the controls, the side quests, everything that the player actively partakes in or utilises will be touched on here. And in light of that, the first game on this list will be The World Ends With You, specifically the final remix version for Switch. You control the protagonist Neku and guide him through Shibuya as he attempts to emerge victorious in the Reaper's Game, a sort of after-death tournament to gain revival, with each day presenting a new challenge for him and his partner who changes at certain parts of the story. If they fail to complete the challenge, they effectively lose their existence. When I first played it back in 2022, I was immediately captivated by how fresh The World Ends With You felt. The art style updated from the original was sharp, stylized and pleasing on the eye, and you noticed almost immediately the amazing soundtrack on top of that. A mix of grunge rock and hip hop beats that admittedly isn't my thing, but is no doubt of a very high quality. The story is very strong and is mostly focused on Neku, who starts off quite brash and untoward, but develops well over the course of the game. And the combat is also good, but only if you played on the original DS version. During the events of the Reaper's Game, you'll be fighting the Noise using psych pins as your method of attack. These pins each represent a different power that Neku can use, and they're activated in varying ways. Since this was originally designed for the DS, there's an emphasis on touchscreen controls to partake in this combat, and that had to be translated to the final remix version for the Switch. The issue though is that the best experience remains on the DS. A few corners had to be cut to port it to mobiles initially and then to the Switch. There are 2 ways you can control Neku. You can use a Joy-Con with the Switch docked, or you can hold the tablet in your hands and use your fingers or a stylus. I opted for the latter option, and I can't deny I never got used to this. I'm more in tune with a traditional controller, especially when some of the pins require very specific actions to use, like swiping in a certain direction or circling a group of enemies. You can get used to it, and I understand that the game was all about its touch controls back in the day, but give me a standard controller any day of the week. And it is the controls that push The World Ends With You onto this list. It's a fantastic game, no doubt, with an equally intriguing plot. But when the game is a straight up pain to play, then I can't look past that. These controls were also a big factor as to why I preferred the sequel, Neo The World Ends With You, that released in 2021. Next up will be the predecessor to one of the finest action RPGs ever made in Nier Automata, that being the remastered Nier Replicant. Now I've made no secret that I adore Nier Automata. It's a 10 out of 10 game for me. I love how the story was delivered, especially its presentation of more thought-provoking themes, and naturally the gameplay was top tier as well. So when I played Replicant in 2022, I wanted to believe that the game would be just as good in some respects, and there's no doubt there are parallels. Replicant shone in so many areas. Though I've never been on board with repeated playthroughs, its narrative was excellent for my personal tastes. The music, well, I can see why it won at the Game Awards that year, and the characters are some of the best I've journeyed with in recent memory. The interchange and commentary between them was wonderful. When I think of great dialogue in JRPGs, I immediately point to Replicant and Grimoire Vice specifically. And those quality elements easily kept me hooked through the sections that for all intents were a bit of a slog, and unfortunately there are a few of those within the game. Despite being a modern upgrade in the words of Square, minus some additional content, this is still a remaster of a title that released over a decade ago, so it's natural that some of the mechanics on offer here haven't aged too well. I was getting the distinct impression that Yoko Taro was trolling the players by forcing them to go back and forth between the same locations at varying points. But the real kicker for me comes in the side quests that are just so bad. A lot of them are the standard fetch quest variant, but some of them require you to get rare drops that can take forever to obtain. I remember one in particular in the factory where you had to get 5 rare drops of a certain enemy, and there were only a few of these enemies per run. The drop wasn't guaranteed, and it took me well over 3 hours to get everything I needed. Add on the uninspired fetch quests and frustrating design at points like the potential to break items if you get hit, and it was a sour spot of the experience overall. The annoying thing though is that you need to do a few of these quests in order to unlock all the weapons, because you need the weapons to see all the endings. And if you're not following a guide, you're not going to know what quests will reward those weapons, so you'll have to do a fair few of them to find the ones you need. Still a great game in many respects, especially on that narrative front, but the quests are a black spot on the canvas. Third game on this list is one that I hold in the highest regard, and my favourite game that I played back in 2021. It's the masterpiece of Vanillaware in 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. More a hybrid visual novel, sure, but it's often recommended on RPG forums, especially to those who have a story preference, and for good reason too. As the title suggests, there are 13 protagonists in this game with 13 unique routes to play through that all contribute to one grand narrative. And though it's definitely a concept that I've seen before in other media, the execution of that premise is top tier. Each character has their own branching path to traverse through, leading to multiple endings, both good and bad. But they're structured in such a way that you want to fill in all the missing gaps. I would have many a sleepless night because the story was so gripping and I wanted to see what came next. No regrets either. That is the mark of something special, a story that demands your attention, that you want to delve deeper into. And despite having 13 different routes, you never feel lost despite the varying perspectives. I liken the story to a jigsaw, starting from the outside and slowly filling it in as you play through. And that's really impressive considering a structure like this can so easily go off the rails. The artwork, it goes without saying, but Vanillaware absolutely killed it in this game, as they always do. Hand-drawn backgrounds and characters melded together seamlessly as you play through, as if witnessing a painting in motion. The sound design, amazing, a case where I wish I had a surround sound system to get the best experience possible. Characters, brilliant, all with engaging personalities, and well voice acted too in both English and Japanese. So clearly Aegis Rim excels in many areas, but it's the other part of the offering that seems to divide opinion. It's split between its story element, noted as the Remembrance mode where dialogue and character arcs take precedence, and Destruction mode where you take control of the Sentinels in a real-time strategy setting. And it's this combat that becomes the ire of some players. It's far from the deepest thing you'll ever see, but there are some players who outright drop the game because of it. And I think that comes down partially to a betrayal of expectation. Aegis Rim was critically acclaimed upon its release, and a lot of JRPG fans jumped in expecting gameplay and story to excel in equal measure, especially those who were coming from previous Vanillaware titles like Odin Sphere. What they found though was a hybrid visual novel, an 80-20 split effectively between story and gameplay, and of course some people just don't like that anyway. The same holds true for Utawareru Mono, which is one of the finest series I've experienced in regards to storytelling. I had no issue with the gameplay. In fact, I liked that there was more focus on the narrative, as that was no doubt the biggest draw of the game. And even then the gameplay was still decent, especially in that final battle, which was a ride in of itself. Needless to say, I recommend Aegis Rim to any story lover of JRPGs. It is one of the finest I've ever experienced, but it's certainly not for everyone. And talking about games that aren't for everyone, next up is the final part of the Sky trilogy in Trails in the Sky III, which shook things up quite significantly from its two predecessors. For one thing, we've got a new protagonist in Kevin Graham, who is a highlight in of himself. He interchanges with Estelle on an almost quarterly basis as my favourite protag in the entire series. On top of that, instead of the exploration of the world inherent in the previous two games, we have a linear dungeon crawling aspect with a central hub, which immediately can be hit or miss for some players. And it goes without saying that the dungeon crawling aspect is what puts Sky III on this list. It's not the kind of gameplay I would have chosen, but I feel that the other aspects of the game more than make up for it, especially on the story front. But there are people who are playing, or have played through the Trails games, who have actively asked if it's worth skipping Sky III because they don't like the gameplay it adopted. And that's a real shame, because Sky III offers so much to the overall mythos and lore of the series. First of all, Kevin is a brilliant protagonist if I didn't make that clear already. He had one game in the spotlight to show us what he's all about, and he delivered in spades. This isn't spoiler territory, so I'll keep his journey brief, but the adventure he goes through along with his squire Rias is one of the finest standalone stories within the entire series. But of course it's not all down to Kevin, as the game also adds in the novel door mechanic, a method by which we can drill into the past or present of certain story arcs. These doors for me are the best part about the game. They add so much more to not only this game but the future of the series too, with a fair few of them being infamous even to this day. It's also one of the only games that allows us a specific glimpse into the workings of the mysterious Septian Church, who are a key player in the developments of Zemuria as a whole, and as such, Sky the Third has a veritable place in the Trails series as a whole. It's a shame that some people feel it's worth skipping because of that gameplay alone. Fifth on the list is level 5 in Studio Ghibli's Ni no Kuni Wrath of the White Witch. We follow Oliver, our main protag, a young boy who travels from his hometown to a mystical world aided by his stuffed animal come to life in Drippy. It takes on the premise of jumping between worlds to progress the narrative, and it's utilised well. If anything, this is one of the many reasons why I prefer the original over the sequel, Revenant Kingdom. Another reason for that though, the visuals. It was a collaboration with Studio Ghibli, an animation studio that is so well known that even those who have no idea about Japanese animation have probably had some form of exposure to their works, whether that be through Howl's Moving Castle, Spirited Away, or My Neighbor Totoro. The game's art style is gorgeous and perfectly encapsulates the fantasy world on offer. When you step into that large world and make your way to the aptly named Ding Dong Dell for the first time, you feel liberated and carefree. The trademark cutscenes reminiscent of the Studio Ghibli style are sprinkled throughout, and it just brings the world to life even more. You'll also meet delightful characters like Drippy himself, who is one of my favourite side characters ever, an example of a mascot done well. The Welsh accent is killer every time, he's the perfect tour guide for this journey, and he just adds so much to the overall package, as do many of the other members of the cast. There's just bountiful amounts of charm in this game, and it left an impression in so many good ways. Even so, I think the only real stumbling block for Ni no Kuni is its combat, a sort of creature collecting archetype that is needlessly annoying to control. The AI is not great, and it's also a bit clunky at times as the battles proceed in real time and you're able to move around freely, but at some points you have to navigate menus while doing that. Thankfully, you do get some more convenient tactical options later down the line, but it is a bit of an acquired taste. I would have preferred, for example, if the all-out attack and all-out defend options were made available from the start, as those are simply the best options available to the player, and made the game much easier to navigate in the later stages. But even with that, Ni no Kuni is still a great game, especially on that story front. It goes for a different angle in many ways, but makes it work, and it sticks in the mind even today. There's a reason why it's still fondly remembered. The penultimate game on this list will be Xenosaga Episode 2. As the name suggests, it's a direct sequel to Episode 1 and effectively follows on immediately after the events of the first game. It's no secret what Monolith Soft wanted Xenosaga to be. They were looking to turn it into a grand story spanning 6 games, but it was infamously cut in half when the later games didn't perform well commercially, and Episode 2 was considered to be the turning point. With the studio young, Takahashi took a step back for the second game and allowed the more junior members an active role in the game's development, allowing them to come up with the ideas and implement them with relative freedom. While an admirable approach, it's fair to say that Episode 2 didn't grab the imagination of many players who liked the first game, and there's no doubt to me that it is by far the weakest entry of the trilogy. But that's not due to the fault of its story or characters. In fact, while the first game had a great narrative overall, I feel that Episode 2 was on another level, and it ultimately made me wonder what the series could have become if it was fully realised. Maybe we're potentially seeing that in Xenoblade Chronicles. I love the idea of switching the perspectives for the main characters, exploring the members who didn't get much of the spotlight in the first game. It gives real depth and meaning to their actions, rather than just falling into that trap of having them there for the ride that many JRPGs often do. Even so, Xenosaga Episode 2 stumbles because of the gameplay. You can point to the art style too, I'm not denying that, but the turn-based combat in particular is just needlessly convoluted. It's at its best during boss fights where you can utilise all the mechanics, but it just doesn't translate well to trash mobs. Building up stocks, hitting the zones of enemies, knocking them up or down to deal more damage and chaining together attacks via the burst mechanic sounds cool, but it's all in that setup. And in the early stages I was just building up stocks before I could even get involved with the fight itself. It's too dependent on time-consuming mechanics. I'm not too big a fan of the skill progression either, where everyone can learn everything. There's freedom there, but the characters lose their individual perks because of it. And on top of that, no currency, because you don't need it. There's no standard equipment management. You can equip items per se in specific slots, but it's nothing like the find vendor and upgrade all items that you'll be used to. No doubt for me there are big flaws in this game, with the combat being its most notable weakness, and I was so happy when the final game reverted to a standard approach that was more slick, streamlined and infinitely more enjoyable to engage in. Even so, still a great story, and it is a short game too, so it has that going for it. And the final game for this list could effectively be the poster child of it too. It's Furyu's often overlooked title in Crystar. You take control of an introverted shut-in called Rei, who is drawn into a mysterious world called Purgatory. After a series of events, she becomes an executor, which is a sort of janitor for the realm, in exchange for granting revival to her sister. To do this, she needs to collect crystallized forms of self-conscious called idea, which are born from tears, and the game proceeds with this as the core focus. Crystar is the epitome of a game that is defined by its story, because without it or the characters, it has nothing. The gameplay loop is depressingly mundane. By design as well, there are no bugs holding it back. Navigate the menus back at home, proceed the story, equip stuff and go to Purgatory to go through the next sequence. The action-based gameplay is fine, nothing special, but the real kicker is that the dungeons are way too long. Multiple layers, a bunch of dead ends, they don't need to be like this. Take 2/3 off them and they'd still be too long. And thankfully the game does allow you in many cases to just run past enemies to get to your destination, which is exactly what I did eventually. And the reason I stuck around is because of that story and the characters. I wouldn't say it outright saved the game, but they were by far and away the only things keeping it afloat. The OST, to a lesser extent, that was pretty good too, but the plot and how the characters developed was quite simply the biggest draw for me, even with the multiple playthroughs required. The thing is, the story and characters had to be great. Any less and the game gets abandoned. This story deserved a better game. The themes covered, like acceptance and forgiveness, are all conveyed really well. It all comes together in a cohesive and satisfying whole, and I think the characters grow in believable and meaningful ways relative to their backgrounds. Everything that happens feels organic based on what is seen in game. Crystar is quite simply the ultimate stress test for a story over gameplay enthusiast. How much repetition and monotony can you handle before you call it quits? I saw it through, and I was glad I did, but I dare say many others would have dropped it within 5 hours, and to be honest, I can't blame them for doing that. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.